So our final presenter for this session is will be Jeff Pulver. Um, his title of his talk is Designing Accessibility into Our Roadways. Jeff is the Director of Research and Innovation at the Maine DOT. He's been working with the Maine DOT since 2018, working as an assistant engineer and a civil transportation engineer. Prior to his work at Maine DOT, Jeff was a design engineer at Goral Palmer. Jeff has a BS in civil engineering and transportation and highway engineering from the University of Maine. Jeff also serves on the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center's Advisory Board. Jeff?
So this is the title of my presentation today, Adapting Transportation Decision-Making Decisions Based on Roadway Context. And that might sound like a foreign theory to you, but try to explain what that means and why it's important for us to do it. So my presentation won't necessarily fit into the fold of, climate sustainability cleanly, which we discussed this before, but, what is sustainability and why do we use that word related to climate? It's, from the climate perspective, there's certain practices that we couldn't continue doing perpetually if we wanted to meet our objectives. And I think that's where this fits into this. There's certain things that we've been doing for a really long time as a nation, as a state, that if we want to meet certain objectives that we have, we're going to have to take a look and adapt. So this is a MaineDOT's mission statement. It's on our website, and I thought I'd put it up here because it kind of centers a conversation. Because most things that we do at MaineDOT, we try to stay on mission and on our goals. So this is to support economic opportunity and quality of life by responsibly providing our customers with the safest and most reliable transportation system possible, given available resources. And that given available resources comment, that's really important, not just from a cost perspective, but from a workforce perspective, which is going to be discussed later today. But looking at some of these things that are on here, our leadership thought that there was opportunities to make improvements in some of these areas like economic opportunity, quality of life, and safety. And we wanted to create some strategies that we could make those improvements while still maintaining a reliable mobility transportation system to help people get where they need to go. So some of these opportunities, getting into them a little bit. So there is a need for system-wide safety improvements. So I'll show something on the next slide about the safe system approach, but this is an approach from European countries that's been highlighted nationally for 5+ years that very strongly as part of our main strategic highway safety plan. It's part of federal highways guidance. It was the theme of the National ASTRA conference this year is safety. And the goal for the safe system approach, it sounds out there given the way crashes are right now in the United States, but the goal is to eventually get closer and closer and eventually reach zero deaths and serious injuries on our roadway network. And if you watch the news and see crashes, there's a lot of fatalities on the roadway network in the United States. So if you're going to get there, you have to make major systemic changes. Also, we want to avoid missed opportunities to provide infrastructure for pedestrian and cyclists, especially on a project level. If we come through, we want to make sure when we leave that project, if it should have pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, we want to make sure it does have that, not just for safety, but also for access to goods and services for those who maybe don't have a vehicle or have a one shared vehicle for a household, especially if they live near areas where they have destinations that they can walk to or bike to. And we want to create a sense of place and community for village areas. So MaineDOT developed a village partnership initiative a couple of years ago. It's a planning study process, and there's dozens of communities that are already participating. And that process usually includes a road safety audit, a group. We got many stakeholders, public works, fire, DOT designers, consultants come together and they review what the town wants to accomplish and how we're going to get there. And one of the major themes is safety for people walking, especially. And a big thing that goes along with that is the speed of vehicles through the village. But it's been hard to get to that end goal without enough guidance and without a strategy to approach that. So we also need to, related to that, we need a way to encourage and help deploy these speed management tactics to slow people down. We would need to do it appropriately without that creeping into areas where it's not appropriate. And speed limit setting for a long time, there's been many considerations for speed limit setting, many factors that go into the decision making. But the way it's typically explained by engineers and practitioners is the 85th percentile speed of people driving on the road. And that message really just hasn't resonated with people for a very long time. It hasn't made sense to the public when we've explained it, and we need to reimagine how we're communicating that and maybe how we are evaluating speed limits as well. So this is the safety systems approach. This figure in the bottom left here is the official symbol from Federal Highway Administration. And this is an approach that was adapted by multiple European processes. And it's a system of strategies that work together. And two of those strategies, the pillars, are safe roads and safe speeds. And what you see when you look at the information is speed is one of the most common impacts for contributing factors for frequency and severity of crashes. And what you see in the top right, you see this is a European research figure adapted to imperial numbers, miles per hour. But there is a point of what they call the target speed where you get to on certain crash types where the likelihood of a fatal or serious injury starts to increase dramatically. And for head-on crashes, that's a higher value. Head-on crash at 25 might not be so concerning, but something at 55 is one of the worst crashes we can have. For a pedestrian and cyclist, that speed is much, much lower, between 20 and 30 miles per hour. And what we have in the bottom right is we looked at 20 years of pedestrian and bicycle crashes on our roadways in Maine. The dark blue is pedestrian, the green is bicycle, and the blue in the middle is ped and bike combined. And because they're a relatively small number of crashes compared to other types of crashes, pulling them together is really the best way to get a trend here. And the vertical axis is the probability or the percentage of those crashes that lead to fatal or serious injury. The other axis is the speed limit. And what you see is that every 5-mile-an-hour increase in vehicle speeds or speed limits, associated vehicle speeds, you get an increase in fatality risk. So we really need to focus in these areas where you need those controlled speeds. We want to make sure we have appropriate speeds, not just speed limit signs, but people actually going slower in these areas where people are walking and biking. So what is the roadway context theory? This image on the left from a research project really depicts that pretty well. It's identifying what type of area you're in and what type of road you're on from the surrounding area, from what are the buildings, what does the landscape look like. And they have, this is the AASHTO 5 example, but you have things like urban core and suburban, and then you also have the rural and the rural town, village type of areas. And it's really using that information in your decision-making process to adapt and make appropriate decisions. This is a figure from a research project as well, which kind of just in general shows how you should prioritize things in decision-making based on the roadway context across the top, but also the priority of the roadway. What is the function of the road and how does that serve the users in our state? So as you see in the rural, mostly undeveloped areas, we tend to, and we should, continue to prioritize mobility between communities because that is an important need. It's important for freight and all these things. In the urban core areas, you tend to prioritize pedestrian and cyclist needs because there's a lot of them walking around. We just saw those numbers about how dangerous that is when people are going fast. And then you also see as the road priority decreases, as it becomes less of an important function for our system, you can also have an opportunity to prioritize pedestrian and bicycles more as well. It's not changing slides. So what we've done is we've created a context classification system for Maine. We went through this a lot and we came up with 5 contexts. We have rural town, village, suburban, and urban. Before, all we had was an urban compact areas and rural outside of that. And this is a more nuanced way to help make better guided decisions. And this fits pretty well within the AASHTO limits, except we decided to divide the rural town into 2 areas, village and rural town, which is like the village would be the very dense areas like Bar Harbor and Booth Bay Harbor and places like that. And we've been working to map that information so that we can have consistent interpretation on a project by project level and on a speed limit evaluation level where it's not in the eye of the beholder to determine what context are I in, and we don't want someone to come back in 3 years and have a different interpretation and have different results. So we've been able to map this statewide. It's almost ready to be released. But this is based on consistent information like how many buildings are there? What is the footprint of those buildings? How close are they to the road? How many intersections are there in the area? How many streets parallel are we? If you take a little bit further of a look back, what's there for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure? What do we have for driveways? Things like that go into this factor and we map it out. It looks pretty good. It looks pretty accurate. Here's a little bit zoomed in to the Lewiston Auburn area as an example. And the red you see here is the urban context, the orange is the suburban, and then everything that's not colored in is the rural. And this is not going to align perfectly with our urban and compact areas. But what we do see is, there are some arterial type roads which are urban, and those are the ones that are really built up. They really have buildings up close there, and we actually believe we can, with certain countermeasures, get people to slow down. There's other areas like you see, like MaineDOT Avenue and Center Street, where things are built much farther back. They're built with, spaced out, and it's a lot harder to impact driver behavior in areas like that. And that tends to be the suburban areas where you have people walking around, but there's also a lot of other uses going on. So we're using this in speed limit setting, as I mentioned, and project scoping, and I'll get into that. But this is why. If we dig into these contexts a little bit more, these are pedestrian and bicycle crash rates per vehicle mile traveled for each of the zones. And you see the urban context all the way to the right obviously has way more pedestrian and bicycle crashes per vehicle than the rural area. But even, it tends to step down as that density decreases. And you might think, looking at that, that the rural town and the rural are pretty close. Why even consider pedestrians there? But even in those two areas, there's still a 4 times higher ped and bike crash rate in the rural town than the rural. So for speed limit setting, we've really created 3 processes considering context and road function. For mobility, really in the rural areas where it's not built up, we're still prioritizing, or we still consider ped and bike needs, but we're prioritizing the travel between communities there. Whereas all users in those urban areas and the village dense areas and the lower priority streets in our rural town and suburban, we're going to have more consideration for ped and bike needs, and we're going to try to slow people down where we can. And the balance is like those high priority roads in those in between contexts where it's really difficult to make decisions, but you have to balance those needs. This plot, this shows the different crash types and how they make up the crash problem for each of these types of processes. So those 3 processes there, the all users, balanced, mobility, and then freeway, we're not considering the context because there's no pedestrian or bicycles allowed on the freeway. But if you look, what you really need to see is that top right, the light green and the dark green. Light green is pedestrian, and the dark green is bicycle. And what that shows in the all users areas is that's a big portion of the problem from a safety perspective. It's about 40% of the fatal and serious injury going on there. And as you go to the balance, that steps down, it's much less, but it's still fairly significant. And if you move into that mobility, those rural areas, it's just a small sliver of what's going on there. So that's why we can't push too much for pedestrian safety there to the point that they will negatively impact these other things, like those bottom 2, the orange and red. Those are lane departure. That's head on and went off road. And that actually really makes up the majority of fatal injuries in the state, as well as rear ends and angle crashes. There's a lot of considerations in there. So we'll do what we can for pedestrians and bicycles in those areas, but we'll really do as much as we can in those other areas. The commissioner likes to say all roads can't be everything to all people. We really need to have a strategic approach to that decision making, and this is how we're trying to do that. As I said, that's a large percentage, a moderate percentage, and a very small percentage of the problem there. So what are we having for changes coming? We have a portion of the website that's being made to kind of centralize all this information and communicate it publicly. We have a complete streets policy that's ready to be released in conjunction with all this other information. We have that complete streets policy also has a project scoping checklist and decision matrices to help get those infrastructure that we need to get the speed management practices that we want to help meet those goals. We also are going to have a public facing version of this roadway context map. It's almost ready. There's a couple more cleanup tasks we need to do. And then we have a new speed limit setting process. We've adapted a tool from a national research project. I think we'll be the first state to implement a process like this, but many other states are working to do such things. Our creative services has produced a good video that explains why we're doing this, how we're setting speed limits, and how it fits into our missions and goals. We also are working on a speed management toolbox to help get practitioners and towns understand what countermeasures are available and appropriate for certain situations. And then there's going to be additional things that come through this as well. And what is this really going to do for us? It's going to improve our safety of our transportation system, especially for our most vulnerable roadway users in those areas. It's going to improve economic opportunity and quality of life with reduced speeds in the town centers and built up areas. It's going to help those towns in the Village Partnership Initiative and other towns reach the goals that they have. And it's also going to help us maintain safe and reliable mobility between the communities. And that is our strategies.